The American Civil War is perhaps the most amazing time period in our history. It defined us as a nation. More Americans died in the American Civil War than any other war we fought in combined. The story we're wanting to tell is that of John White Gary. Gary was a very interesting man. He was very patriotic and deeply religious. And when the war broke out, he followed his patriotic ideals and went back in uniform again, rose to the rank of brigadier general. His eldest son, Eddie, followed him into the war and became a young artillery lieutenant. In fact, he was assigned to his father's division, and by 1863, Gary was commanding the White Star Division in the Army of the Potomac. By the fall of 1863, the Civil War was going into its third year, with really no end in sight. More than 35,000 men were killed or wounded in the Battle of Chickamauga. The Confederate Army quickly encircled the Union Army at Chattanooga and began to lay siege to them. Soldiers there began to starve and suffer pretty badly. President Lincoln knew that Chattanooga was the key to winning the Civil War. Gary's division was transferred west along with other units to help break the siege at Chattanooga. After a long, tiring march, they arrived in Lookout Valley on October 28th, right under the loom of Lookout Mountain. Gary would meet with his son that day, who had just received a promotion as captain of artillery and was about to be transferred out of his division. That night, under a full moon, about midnight, a Confederate brigade attacked Gary's division, and in 3 hours of furious fighting, Gary's son, Eddie, was killed. We have original accounts that talk about how General Gary found his son dawn the next morning on top of the artillery hill, quietly knelt down and embraced him. That event changed Gary more than any other in his life. It shattered him, really. He lost his faith. He found himself hating everybody around him and lots of anger. This went on for some weeks until finally one day his aide-de-camp, Sean McGregor, recommended that Gary go down to Lookout Creek for an unofficial inspection. It seems the soldiers had called an unofficial truce on their own. They had decided that killing a picket was tantamount to murder and wasn't going to change the war one way or the other. And so they'd begun leaving their weapons behind and going down to the creek or in the woods between the lines and talking to each other and trading items like food and souvenirs. Gary went down with McGregor and they spent the day looking, and he was witnessing numerous acts of this trading going on, and it intrigued him greatly. Finally, he decided to don the uniform of a private and to go in disguise and go down to the creek himself and interact with one of the Confederate pickets just to see what this was all about. Up to this point, Gary wasn't sure he was going to be able to carry on as a division commander. He wrote to his wife Mary that, following his son's death, that when he looked at the soldiers in his camp, all he could see were the faces of other fathers' sons out there, and was dreading leading them to their death. But in this exchange with his Confederate picket, he found his faith once again and was able to put the grief and loss of his son behind him. That evening he returns and finds out that he is going to be ordered to assault Lookout Mountain the very next morning. This seemed like an incredible order, mainly because everybody considered Lookout Mountain impregnable. But as they marched towards Lookout Mountain, a deep fog set in that masked their movements and marched up the mountain before the initial assault. It saved their lives. Gary was convinced that God was looking after him and his men, and that he made that fog stay there, much like making the sun stand still. They assaulted successfully, were able to take the lower and middle part of the mountain that day with almost no casualties and capturing over 1,000 Confederate prisoners. But they knew that the next day they weren't going to be that lucky. Gary prayed that night for a miracle. And during the night, the Confederates on top of Lookout Mountain, who could have held off Gary's division easily, were ordered off. The next morning, Gary orders Captain Wilson of the 8th Kentucky and 5 men to go up the Palisades to see if the Confederates were still on top of the mountain. They climbed up the ladders and reached the summit, and to their surprise, the Confederates were gone. Wilson took the flag of the 8th Kentucky and marched out on Lookout Point and set it and unfurled it right then and there. As the flag unfurled, the first rays of dawn hit it, and Gary and his men looked up from below and saw the American flag flying from on top of Lookout Mountain. It was perhaps the most stirring moment during the Civil War. They said that you could hear the roar of the soldiers as it started from the mountain all the way down to the valley in Chattanooga, as these thousands of Union soldiers saw the American flag on this impregnable fortress and began to cheer. This is the climax of the film, the pivotal moment when we realize that this one man Not a general, but simply a father who's grieving his son and lost his faith, has found it again and realizes that God is the center of everything.